Okay, today's daf is Shabbat daf Kuf Nun Daled. Really, really nearing the end. You can see it; it's in sight. Just to remind everyone, the siyum's on Sunday. We already have hundreds of people registered. It's really, truly amazing, and I hope you're all coming. Just to some details, we're going to be learning the end of the daf on Sunday. I will put up, for those who aren't going to be at the siyum, number one, I'm going to put the podcast up as usual, so it'll be up by Monday morning, like it usually is. And the whole siyum will be also on video. So if anyone can't come, there'll be a video of it. You can watch it after. It'll be both on Facebook Live and on Zoom. So anyone who wants to log on Facebook Live, you can do that. And because it's on Facebook Live, the video just sits on Facebook after it's over. So it'll be there, and we'll put it up by the next day. We'll have it up also on the site. So you can see all the different parts of the siyum. Okay, so that's at the siyum. A few about Eruvin. So Eruvin, one of the things you need to know about Eruvin is that pictures are very helpful. So there's a bunch of picture books available. I'm not sure how to access all these books, and especially in America, how to get them. The best book that existed until now is the Daf Yomi puts out a book. Their book is no longer in print. I've looked around, but you can buy their Gemaras that have the pictures in the back. Okay, so you can look up online the Daf Yomi. I'm not sure of the distribution in America. I know here there's just a phone number you call, you order, and they can deliver it to your house. It's just a regular Gemara with pictures in the back. And in the Gemara, there's little stars that kind of tell you, oh, on this page, there's a picture, go look there. You know, and by each, wherever, on whatever word there's picture, you can look there. You have to always remember, with pictures, there's always a problem because the pictures show one interpretation, right? Sometimes there's multiple interpretations. Once in a while, they'll have a picture, oh, this is Rashi, this is the Rambam, etc. But again, just like any commentary, you're only getting one approach. So that's a downside. There's a new book that's coming out that apparently isn't even, it's at printers, when I spoke to them earlier this week, by Kol Halashon. So you can look up on their site. They claim that they're going to have distribution in America, but being that they haven't even distributed it here yet, I'm not exactly sure how they're planning to do that. But look up on their site, Kol Halashon, and see if you can order it. I ordered one, but they haven't brought it to me yet, so I don't know. Spoke to them earlier this week, but I can't vouch for it. I haven't seen it, but I assume it's a good book and it's helpful. Plus the Schottenstein and the Koren, both of them have lots of pictures. They don't have as many as these books do, but they're both helpful. Someone asked me yesterday, which is a better edition, the Koren or the Schottenstein? Really, both of them have pros and cons. Each one, you know, it's more a personal preference. The Schottenstein very much goes into the structure. It's very clear, the structure from the Schottenstein, which is a little bit less clear from the Koren, but the Koren has excellent language and background and interesting details they go into. They're both excellent. I mean, the best is to have both and use them both, but I can't recommend one over the other. It's really a matter of personal preference. Some people prefer to have the Tzurat Hadaf, which you have in the regular, you don't have you have in the Schottenstein, you don't have in the Koren. You have it in the back of the Koren, but it's not as you're learning. There's all different approaches. Plus they have in the Koren, it's nice in the back where they have the actual Gemara, it has nikudot, it has punctuation, the vowels in it, which is also helpful for some people. So there's a lot, each one is great. I recommend them both. It's just a matter of personal preference. Okay, with that intro, I figured let me give you the intro to Eruvin a little earlier so that you have some time to try to get yourself a book or two, if that works. Okay, we're now gonna start. So we ended, so today's sponsorships for today. Two important sponsorships. Today's daf is sponsored by Leslie Jacoby Green in honor of the first yahrzeit of her wonderful father, Alexander Jacoby, alav shalom, Yoshua Aryeh ben Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen. He survived starvation, hardship, and the Dachau concentration camp as a teenager. He persevered to build a life in New York, along with his wife Rose, also a survivor, and to impart to his children and grandchildren a love for Judaism and a belief in the destiny of the Jewish people in Eretz Israel. He's deeply missed and forever in our hearts. And by Devara Asheim for the 40th yahrzeit of her beloved father, David Asheim, Zichrono Livracha, an ardent Zionist. He'd be amazed by all the learning now available to women, especially his public school educated daughter. With that, we will get started for today. We ended with Rami Bar Chama. Okay, we saw this opinion. The whole question became, we were talking about mechamel, but if you help your animal carry a load on Shabbat, what is your obligation? Okay, there's a sheet for today. I didn't see, did they put it on? If someone could put it up in the chat, that would be helpful. The sheet for today. And if you're listening, then pull it up. It'll definitely be useful. There's different charts there that will help you organize the daf. I see someone also wrote in the chat that Vishinantam has an illustrated book. It's not a whole Gemara, but it's also helpful. So you can also look there. Okay, so getting to the Gemara. We had Rami Bar Chama, and Rami Bar Chama said, when we started with this issue, if your animal, you do work with your animal. It's kind of like Shnayim Shasa'ua, two people doing things together. You're basically helping the animal load up the burden on its back. So now the question is, are you obligated in doing this? So we saw that Rami Bar Chama said, in fact, you are obligated for Mechamer. It says, not only are you obligated, as if it's a malacha. B'shogeg, you have to bring a chatat, b'mezid, chayav skila. To that we said, right, and where do we get that from? Lo tasek kol malacha, ata u'v'imcha, uvehemtecha. Okay, you and your animal, you're all chayav in Shabbat. It says lo tasek kol malacha. So therefore, you're obligated for your animal. You get skila or chatat. To which Rava said, number one, when it talks about korban chatat by avodah zarah, it says the word ta'aseh. You have to do it. If you don't do it yourself, you're not obligated. So if you don't bring a korban chatat, if you do avodah zarah, if you don't do it yourself, then you shouldn't be chayav a korban chatat for Shabbat either. And if you're not chayav a korban chatat, we know that the two are intertwined. If you're chayav a chatat, then you get skila. That's what we said. So the assumption is, if you're not chayav chatat for doing it unwittingly, then a sin offering, then you're not going to be obligated by getting stoned. So therefore, they reject this. And additionally, he says, it also says, one is b'chalal Shabbat b'davar shechayavim al shgagato chatat ba'al zdono skila, seems to imply that there's some other malacha that you're not going to be chayav. Okay, the way it was right, it sounded like there are those that you're chayav, both chatat and skila, which seem to imply there must be something else, and that must be mechamer. Okay, which means you're not. And then the Gemara answered that by saying, oh no, you could say it's tchumin, according to Rabbi Kiva, or it's havara, according to Rabbi Yossi. Now we're going to see the second version of Rami Bar Chama. Rav Zviv Matnehacha, starting at the very top of our daf. Amal Rami Bar Chama, hamechamer achar behema b'Shabbat, b'shogeg, eino chayav chatat, b'mezid chayav skila. This is an in-between position. If you do it, you're not going to be obligated a chatat. You don't bring a sin offering, because why? Well, we learned already that the sin offering verse about the sin offering you bring if you do avodah zarah unwittingly says you have to actually do it yourself. Therefore, a sin offering is specific only if you do it yourself. However, skila, stoning, you can get even not, because there was no verse to exclude that. And in fact, the verse that said, lo tasek kol malacha, where we learned that you get stoned, says you and your animal. So therefore, you must get stoned. You must, yes, get stoned, but not the sin offering. Mativ Rava. Rava says, how can you say this? HaMechalel et HaShabbat. Remember, he was the one who questioned the first version also. In this version, he also has a problem. HaMechalel et HaShabbat b'davar shechayavin al shigato chatat. It says, if you desecrate Shabbat in a way that you're obligated to bring, if unwittingly you bring a chatat, chayavin al zdono skila. Then if you do it intentionally, you're going to have to be stoned. What can one infer from this? That the two are intertwined. Ha-en chayavim al shigato chatat, en chayavim al zdono skila. So one can infer from this that if it says, when you're chayav a shkaga, when you bring a sin offering, you also get stoned. Sounds like if you don't bring a sin offering, then you don't get stoned. Okay, that's how they read it, which means to say you can't have a case where you don't bring a sin offering, but you do get stoned. So therefore, he rejects Rami Bar Chama. So the Gemara now has an answer to this. They say, wait, you didn't read that line carefully. Mikatane ha'en chayavim. It doesn't say, it says if you bring a sin offering, then you get stoned. It doesn't say if you don't bring a sin offering, you don't get stoned. One can read it like this. Hachi kamar. Davar shechayavin al shigato chatat, chayavin al zdono skila. It's true that if you do have a sin offering, you are definitely going to get stoned if you did that same act intentionally. But yesh davar she'en chayavim al shigato chatat, b'chayavin al zdono skila. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that if you don't bring a sin offering, you don't get skila. What it means is, anytime there is a sin offering, then you will definitely, for that same act, if you do it intentionally, you will get stoned. But you could also get stoned in a case where there's no chiyuv chatat. So therefore, they say it doesn't necessarily lead to saying that, and it could say what Rami Bar Chama is saying, in which case, if you read it that way, what would be the case where you don't have a sin offering, but you do get stoned? It would be exactly our case. This is the perfect scenario, because You're missing the asiyah. You didn't actually do it yourself. So you're not going to bring the sin offering, but your animal did do malacha and you kind of facilitated that. So you are, if you do it intentionally, you are going to get stoned. And that explains the second version of Rami Bar Chama. Now we're going to have a third option, not a third option in Rami Bar Chama, but someone else's opinion. But before we get there, we're going to a little bit discuss who's talking here because there's a little bit of a problem. Rava, achua de Rav Meri Bar Rachel, va'amrela avua de Rav Meri Bar Rachel. Rava, who is the brother of Rav Meri Bar Rachel, or he was the father of Rav Meri Bar Rachel. What's the problem? Well, Lelishna Batra Kashya. And in fact, the second Lashon is difficult. And in fact, Rashi even says that he wipes this whole section, he says, shouldn't even be in the Gemara. It's a total mistake. So the Gemara says the second Lashon is very difficult. Why? What do we know about Rav Meri Bar Rachel? So first of all, so every time we have this, when someone's called by their mother's name, it's because there's some issue with the father. What's the issue with his father? So Rachel is the daughter of Shmuel. The daughters of Shmuel got taken into captivity. Rachel ended up meeting this non-Jewish man. They ended up getting married, and he converts after Mary was conceived already, and that's why Mary is called by his mother's name and not his father's name. His father was Isur Giora. Okay, they call him Isur the Ger. So now they say, what's the issue here? So first of all, the Gemara tells us, it says that Rava was his father, right? Rava, the father of Mary Bar Mary Bar Rachel. So how could he be the father? We know the father is Isur Giora, so it can't be him. So here it says, Mary Bar Rachel umanye beporse de Bavel. He got appointed to be one of the policemen or officers that worked for the Babylonians, and Rav, he was kind of the local leader in Bavel, not for the Babylonians really, but in Bavel. Okay, there was this local leadership the Jews had, and in order to be a leader, you had to be a, so to speak, kosher Jew, and you had to have good lineage. So there was a bit of a question about him because he was conceived when his father wasn't even Jewish. So there's a bit of a question about his lineage. But Rav Echsherei Mary Bar Rachel, he said he's kasher and he can do it, and he appointed him to this job. If you look at Rashi says because his mother was Jewish, and because his mother's Jewish, and we go by the mother, so he was totally fine, and he becomes appointed to this job. But what do you see? It can't possibly be Rava was his father. He wouldn't need this special hechsher process if his father was Jewish. So therefore, again, his father was a ger, but only after he was conceived. And that's where the problem comes in. If his father was a ger, it wouldn't have been a problem. But his father wasn't Jewish when he was conceived, and that's why he needed this special shiur. So basically, the Gemara says it can't possibly be that Rava was his father. I also have to question, could Rava even be his brother, the first version? Because we don't know that Rava was Mary Bar Rachel's brother. Maybe it's a different Rava. Maybe it's the same Rava. I don't know. It's a little bit confusing either which way. But getting back to our topic, because we really want to know the content. It's interesting, the Gemara goes to lengths to talk about who exactly this was, because usually that's not the focus of what they're talking about. But now back to our topic. So so the Gemara answers, sorry, we didn't finish this. Dilma Trey Mary Bar Rachel Havu. Maybe there were two people by the same name, and maybe this isn't the same Mary Bar Rachel that we know of, who's the daughter of Shmuel, and maybe it's somebody else. Okay, a little bit strange to think that there's two people with the name Mary Bar Rachel. Most people aren't named for their mother, and if he really was Rava was his father, you would think he'd be named by Rava's name. So it's still not a perfect answer, but it is a potential answer that the Gemara gives. So now he says, Havamatne la lahashma te mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. He learned this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, not in the name of Rami Bar Chama, and liftol, that he taught that Rabbi Yochanan said the person is patur. Okay, so we have three options. Remember, Rami Bar Chama, either he's obligated, the owner's obligated everything, shkaga, if it's for shkaga chatat, for mezid skila, or we have the in-between. No, you don't get a chatat based on the verse, but yes, right, based on the verse of Avodah Zarah, but yes, you do get skila based on lo taseh kol melacha, and listed there is the behema. Comes Rabbi Yochanan, he says, no, you don't get either. And here we're going to show why. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, amchamer achar behemto b'Shabbat patur miklum. You're exempt from everything according to him. Why? Well, b'shogeg, that's easy to prove. Lo machayev chatat dihuksha kol haTorah kula l'avodah zarah. We already learned that Torah achat. Remember, we learned everything in the Torah is compared to Avodah Zarah. And since Avodah Zarah, you're not going to be obligated unless you do it yourself. You're also not going to be obligated here unless you do it yourself. So therefore, b'mezid nami lo l'chayev. And b'mezid nami lo m'chayev. And why are you going to be obligated if you did it intentionally from stoning? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, hamechalel et haShabbat b'davar shechayavim al shigato chatat va'al zdono skila. Okay, the sentence says, if you're mechalel Shabbat in a way that you're obligated, shkaga chatat and zdono skila, if you did it intentionally skila, seems to imply what? Ha'en chayavim al shigato chatat, ein chayavim al zdono skila. It seems to imply, one second, I just want to check one thing. Right. It's not ve'al zdono. You have to read it differently. Notice there's a bet by the word ve'al. It should be read. If you look at the bet, it sends you to Hagahot Abach, who basically corrects the text. Get rid of the word ve'al. Now I'm going to read it differently. Hamechalel et haShabbat b'davar shechayavim al shigato chatat. He says you get rid of the vav, and it should say chayavim al zdono skila. It makes a big difference if you read it one way or the other. If you read it the first way, the way it's written, it sounds like if you desecrate Shabbat in a way where unwittingly you'd be obligated to sin offering, and intentionally you'd be chayav skila, then it's kind of saying, oh, well, there's another way where you're not obligated anything, and that's what we went before with either this, or maybe it's tchumen, or maybe it's, but if you read it as hamechalel et haShabbat b'davar shechayavim al shigato chatat, kama chayavin al zdono skila, that seems to imply that it's right? They're interconnected. If you're chayav chatat, then you'll be chayav skila, which seems right. It's an if-then statement. It's an if-then statement, right? I'm thinking of all those logic, right? Inverse, converse, all those things. So now they say, so that would imply ha'en chayavim al shigato chatat, ein chayavim al zdono skila. So then it would seem to imply, right? If then implies only if then. If the if is not true, then the then won't be true, and therefore you wouldn't be obligated. So therefore, and then. Now, okay, so we're not obligated skila and we're not obligated chatat. That we got. However, you might say, okay, but sometimes when we have a case where theoretically maybe you should be obligated skila and then it doesn't, right, for whatever reason, it's not the case. So let's go down a level. We're not going to go to 0. We don't go from 100 to 0. What will we go to? Some midpoint. What's the midpoint? Malkot. Maybe you should get lashes. So comes the Gemara and says, B'lav nami lo m'chayev. You're also not chayav. You might say lo taseh kol malacha. It's a lo taseh. On every lo taseh where there's an action, you're obligated lashes. So maybe you should get lashes, right? Unless it's mita beitin. So what does the Gemara say? No, you're also not going to be obligated lashes because ahavele lav shenitan l'asharat mita beitin. Chol lav shenitan l'asharat mita beitin ein lo kinalav. This is what we call. Okay, let's go back and give some background. Whenever you get punished in the Torah, there has to be both a pasuk saying, this is your punishment, and a warning. There's an azhara. So this is the azhara where it says, don't do this. It doesn't say the punishment here, but it says, lo ta'aseh kol malacha ata and uvehemtecha. That's the warning. Now, a warning is associated with a punishment. When you have a warning, lo ta'aseh kol malacha is associated with the punishment of skila, which is a mitah that's given by a capital punishment case, basically. On the hands of the court. According to this opinion, we're going to see there's a debate about this, but if you have a lo ta'aseh, a case where, like I said before, where for whatever reason you can't get the owner, it's connected to a mita beitin, skila, but you can't get the skila because here you didn't do it yourself, your animal did it, or you helped your animal, but you didn't do it yourself. You're not obligated, you don't get skila. But you might think you get lashes, no. Since it's part of a general lav, where that lav has a mita beitin associated with it, something very stringent, we're not going to obligate you in lashes. This is very similar, maybe it's even an outgrowth of, we talk about kimle b'derabba mine. When you do one action that obligates you both in something more severe and something less severe, you're always going to get the more severe punishment. And even if the more severe punishment isn't able to be administered, you're usually exempt from the other one. And that's what it's saying here. So therefore, you're not going to get lashes either. And then he adds, afilu lemanda amar lokin. Well, there is a debate about this. So even if you hold that you do get lashes for a lav shenitan l'asharat mita beitin, still, there's still another reason to exempt you. And this is interesting. And maybe if you say this in Kiddush tomorrow, you'll think about this pasuk in a bit of a different way. It certainly made me rethink how I view that verse. Lo ta'aseh kol malacha. It said, then lichtov rachmana, the pasuk should have said, lo ta'aseh kol malacha uvehemtecha. Ata lamali. they're now saying, why does the verse say, Lo ta'aseh kol malacha, don't do any work, ata, you, ubincha, ubitcha, right, your son, your daughter, avdecha v'amatcha, your servants, uvehemtecha. Now there's one word that's really unnecessary. Lo ta'aseh kol malacha is addressed to you. It doesn't need to say you and your son and your daughter and your slave. It could just say, don't do any malacha, uvitcha, uvincha, uvitecha, v'avdecha v'amatcha. It didn't need to say ata. So why does it say ata? Hu nihu de mechayev, behemto lo mechayev. What does this mean? It's to teach you ata, take a break. Lo taseh kol malacha ata. You can't do any malacha. If you do it, you're going to get punished. Then it moves on to say, and by the way, you're also responsible for your entire household. So it's your responsibility to ensure that your household doesn't do malacha. If you think about it, bincha ubitecha. If they're already adults, then they're going to be getting punished on their own. They don't need to be in this pasuk as bincha ubitecha. If they're not adults, then no one's getting punished for them, right? We know you don't get punished for a minor. So it's not like you get punished for them. So it makes perfect sense now. It's basically saying to the owner of the household, you're responsible, and this is interesting, if you think about it, you're responsible to ensure that Shabbat is kept in your household. It goes back to what we're saying about Amir al-Akum and how if you have a non-Jew do malacha for you, sort of like malacha is happening in your house on Shabbat, and how can you allow that? Right? We raised it as a question, and we gave an answer for it, but it's really a question as to, you have to make sure that the Avirah of Shabbat is kept in your house, that you don't have your kids doing malacha, even though they're not really obligated, or your animals doing malacha, even though you're not going to actually get punished for them, or your slaves. But with slaves, actually, I think do get punished. But in any case, the point is that that verse, even if slaves do get punished, that verse is basically for the owner of the household making sure that Shabbat is kept in his household. And it's not talking about punishments if it's not, because he's not responsible for other people's actions to the extent that they'll get punished. He's responsible to ensure that there's an Avirah Shabbat in his house and the people aren't doing it. He's not going to get stoned for that. There's two separate things going on. And that's why I said you're going to view this differently, because the ata is one thing. And then the rest of that verse is a whole category of people that means, well, ensuring your household that Shabbat is kept. Okay, so that's a whole different way of looking at that pasuk, really. And it makes perfect sense, because again, not all those people are going to get punished for what they're doing. So therefore, that supports Rabbi Yochanan that you don't get punished for mechameh. So again, we saw all three options: either yes chatat, yes skila, or no chatat, yes skila, or nothing at all, not even a lo taseh. Theoretically, one could say maybe there's a fourth possibility, which isn't brought, which is you don't get chatat or skila, but you do get lashes. Okay, that's not mentioned here. I guess nobody holds that way. Okay, back to our Mishnah. Okay, who can remember the Mishnah? We got sidetracked. So the Mishnah was talking about mishich shich baderech. Remember, you're on your way home and you get stuck, right? We talked about an airplane. You could also get stuck in terrible traffic. There's traffic on the highway. You don't make it home. And again, you have to wonder what happened in their day, because they didn't have traffic, they didn't have air travel, they didn't have all those things. But inevitably, something could have stopped you along the way. You get delayed. And what do we say? Remember, there was the whole hierarchy, what you do with your stuff. Then, higia lachatzara chitzona notelet hakelim anitalim b'Shabbat. So now when you get into the city, you go to the nearest, right? You get into the nearest Reshut Yachid, you take off your kelim that aren't muktzah, you remove them from the donkey. V'she'einam nitalim b'Shabbat, matir achavalim v'asakim noflim elehen. If they're muktzah, you untie the ropes and everything falls. So now we're going to have a discussion about this. Amar Rav Huna. We're going to start by bringing a halacha of Rav Huna, and from there the Gemara is going to ask various questions. Hayta behemto te'una kles chuchit. If it had glass vessels on it, so you can't just untie the ropes and they're going to fall and break. So what do? Mevi karim ukisatot uminiach tachteha umatira chavalim v'asakin noflim. So you bring pillows and blankets and all sorts of things that will protect it from breaking. And then you untie it and they fall on a soft landing and they don't break. So the first big question becomes, look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, no telet hakelim anitalim b'Shabbat. Why do you have to untie them and let them fall? They're glass vessels. They're not muktzah. And we already learned in the Mishnah, if they're not muktzah, you can take them off by hand. So why can't you just remove them by hand? Should be not a problem. So the answer, Kika'ama Rav Huna must have been talking about glass utensils that are muktzah. What could possibly be muktzah, glass utensil? Bekarne de umna, de lo chazyale. It must be, these are, I call them test tubes, right? The tubes right? The keren, it's a horn. There must have been horn-shaped tubes that the bloodletter would use for taking blood. So these are muktzah. Now, good question. Why are they muktzah? Two different explanations brought. One is because they're disgusting. Muktzah machmat miyus. If you remember, we learned that things that are disgusting, you don't want to touch on Shabbat, and therefore they're muktzah. You don't want to have anything to do with them. So why are they muktzah machmat miyus? Because they're full of blood. It's disgusting. That's one answer. Another answer is they're muktzah machmat chesron kis. What's that? Special utensils used only for a particular purpose, and you keep them and you protect them. There were bloodletters. This is his business. This is his stuff. So maybe because of chesron kis. Either which way, Rav Huna must have been talking about glass utensils that could have been muktzah. Otherwise, there'd be no reason to drop them on the floor, and then you have to start bringing pillows and blankets. Now there's a second problem, and this is why he even needs to tell you. Why does he need to tell you? This is what, he's just giving you good advice, bring pillows and blankets so they don't break? No, he's trying to teach you a halacha, and this, the Gemara is going to question. If you're going to now throw these muktzah items that you can't move on Shabbat onto blankets and pillows, these blankets and pillows will not be able to be moved for the rest of Shabbat because they now have muktzah items on them, and you can't move the muktzah items, so you obviously are not going to be able to access these. Now, we already learned this before, that you're not allowed to be mevatel kli mehechano. If a utensil is ready to be used on Shabbat, your pillow or blanket can be used on Shabbat. You can't render it useless. You can't put something muktzah on top of it that now it can't ever be moved. So how do we allow this? So the answer, b'shlife zutre. It must be that there were small bundles of these glass utensils with the bloodletter. And then what would happen? If that's the case, you can move. Remember, we had the dead body on the pillow, and you can move the pillow out from underneath, and the dead body will fall on the ground, and that will keep the body cold from the ground and not hot from the pillow or blanket. So, and keep it from rotting. So likewise here, these glass utensils, if you slowly pull out the pillow without actually moving, you have to question, even if you're moving it, it's really tiltum and atzad, so it would be allowed. Since you can actually theoretically access them, and you can, Rashi even says, you move it from one pillow to another pillow to another pillow till it eventually goes on the floor, and it's very, gradual how you get it there. Therefore, it's not actually canceling out this pillow. The pillow is still accessible, even though there's glass utensils on it that are muktzah. Okay, that was the first question. So we had two questions on Rav Huna. First, we said, how could it be that you would even have glass items that are muktzah? They say, no, it is muktzah. Well, then how can you put the karim and kisatot? Isn't that canceling it out? So we say, no, that's not a problem. Now we'll bring another question. Okay, so, meitive. Hayta behem tot te'una tevel v'ashishiyot, matir et hakarvalim v'asakim noflim me'alehem, v'af al pi shemishtabrim. Now we have a bit of a different case. If your animal is carrying tevel, tevel is something that's muktzah. It's foods that you haven't taken truma to masor from. So that, if that's on your animal, or you have ashashiyot, which are glass jars, usually they were used for candles. They were glass jars that could be used for other things. What do? You untie the ropes and the bags fall on their own, even though they might break. So what do you see here? First of all, what don't they offer you here? To put the pillows down, right? And they talk about the kalim breaking. So let's see. So what do they answer? Hatan, and again, right, first of all, why aren't we allowed to move them? And number two, why are they muktzah? They're shishiyot, right? And then why can't you put the pillows underneath? So the answer, hatan bikulsa. There's all sorts of words here that we never really come across in general. So Rashi tells us, what is kulsa? They're wide or thick pieces of glass, or wide rechavot, that what's their einam kelim. They're not actually, it's not a shishiyot, like I said, some sort of glass which you can use, but it's a glass, like a bar of glass or something, where, what do you do with them? You make windows out of them. And what do you do? Ein hefsei b'shviratan, Rashi says. Nothing's going to happen to them, because what do you do anyway? To make the window, apparently, you break the glass and then you weld it back together. I don't know what the word is, but it's not exactly glass blowing, but somehow you make this out of the broken pieces of glass. So therefore, you don't care if it breaks. And that's why we don't allow you to put pillows underneath, because we're now going to, these are things that we don't really care if they break. So now, and it could be also, you can't roll them off the pillows either, because they're these big, thick pieces of glass. They wouldn't, right? The other one we said they could be rolled off the pillows because they're small. So here we don't allow you, because once you put them on the pillows, you're not going to be able to get them off the pillows. So now we're going to have a bit of a problem with this, though. First, they say, Daikanami Dikatani. So first, we're going to prove it. Makes sense that this is something like these big pieces of glass. Dumia de Tevel, because they're mentioned right next to Tevel. Often we say, if two things are mentioned together in the Braita, it must be that one is like the other. Ma Tevel de lo chazile, af hachanami de lo chazile. Just like Tevel is, now, it's a little bit tricky what it means lo chazile. Usually that means it's muktzah. It's not worthy for anything on Shabbat. Likewise, this glass is not worthy for anything on Shabbat. The problem is that we're trying to distinguish between this and the previous case of the glass of the blood letter. That was also muktzah. So it's hard to say lo chazile is muktzah. So you'd have to say something a little more loose fitting, which is more like it's not usable as they are, right? Tevel is not usable as it is. This glass is not usable as it is. Why? Exactly as we said, we're going to make a glass, a window out of it or something, but right now it's not in any usable form, okay? And that's why we're going to say that he allows it to fall even though they're going to break because we don't really care if they break. Well, then comes the big question. If we don't really care if they break, then why does the Braita say even if they're going to break? That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, the breaking must have some significance. So they say, well, it has minor significance. What is that? You might think that maybe they'd allow you to throw this onto pillows and blankets because think about what happens. When you drop it onto the floor, what's going to happen? It's going to break. Now, you're going to end up with a bunch of big chunks, and you're going to end up with a bunch of really teeny shards that are going to be very hard to pick up off the ground. So in the end, what are you going to do? You're going to collect all the pieces and make a new window out of it. So you're not going to really lose anything, but you will lose some. Some of it's going to get lost in the process because some of it's going to break up into such small pieces that you won't be able to use them anymore. And therefore, they're saying, well, maybe you would think because of even though they break and you might lose a little bit, you're still not allowed to throw them onto pillows and blankets. So we started with Rav Huna about the klei zchuchit. You can bring pillows and blankets, and then we had to explain exactly what type is he talking about and what would be the case in other types of glass utensils, right? Either ones that aren't muktzah, you can take off yourself without dropping, or if they're like these big bars of glass that we don't really care if they break, then you're not even allowed to put them onto karim ukisatot, onto pillows and blankets. Now we're moving on to another Braita. Tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Hayta behemto teuna shlik shel tfuah. If you're holding a bundle of wheat or grain, meniach rosho tachteha, you put what's the problem? It's muktzah. So what do? You put your head underneath. Umisakol etzad acher v'hu nofel me'elav. Okay, you basically stick your head under, knock it over. Okay, that's again tiltul b'shinoi, right? You're knocking it off with some sort of change. Here we get to a very interesting, maybe disturbing story. Chamoro shel Rabban Gamliel, the donkey of Rabban Gamliel, hayta te'una dvash. He was carrying a load of honey. V'lo ratza leporka ad motzei Shabbat. He didn't want to take it off before the end of Shabbat. He thought it was problematic. Lemotzei Shabbat meta, and the animal died on Motzei Shabbat because the burden was too heavy for it, and it died. Okay, it weakened the animal, and the animal died. That's pretty serious. And if you remember, when we talked about this at the beginning, why did we say you're allowed to take off the load? The whole issue is that you want to prevent the animal from tsar balei chayim, right? From suffering. Before I go on, I just see someone asked a question about bringing pillows and blankets. Isn't it a problem of carrying? We're talking about here, remember, he goes into the chatzara chitzona. He goes into a courtyard. The assumption is in a space where you can carry. Not a problem of hotzais. Let's say you can't carry from the house to the courtyard, but assuming there's pillows and blankets in the courtyard, then you find pillows and blankets in the courtyard and you use those. Right, we're isolating issues here. It's not, that would be a separate issue, but that's not what they're discussing. Okay, so now we're going to have to discuss Rabban Gamliel. Okay, this sounds pretty serious. So they brought this Braita because they want to question Rabban Gamliel from our Mishnah. Doesn't it say, so first question is, kelim ani talim. Notel kelim ani talim. If there's something that's not muktzah, you can take it off. So why didn't Rabban Gamliel take this off? This was honey. Honey's not muktzah. Honey you can eat. Of course it's not muktzah. So they answer kishi yidvish. The dvash was spoiled. And that's why it was muktzah. Well, now they ask another good question, which is, hidvish l'may chazeh. Well, then what was he carrying it for if it was spoiled honey? Right? Why did he need it in the first place? So they answer, chazeh l'ketita. It's valuable for what? for ketita de gamle. That's, if you remember, we learned this when we talked about medicinal purposes and all those things. It was for a wound for a donkey, for a camel. They would use honey to put on a wound to cure it, to help cure. So now we have this case where basically we end up saying, okay, he was carrying this honey. The honey was muktzah. We have to come up with a muktzah situation. It's usable, but it's not usable for its general use, and therefore we're not going to say that it's an issue. We're going to say, number one, that it was muktzah enough that he couldn't take it off, but it wasn't so useless that he wasn't going to be using it at all. Okay, so he's allowed to use it. He had a purpose for it. That's why he was carrying it on his donkey, but it was muktzah for Shabbat because we don't generally use spoiled honey, even if it's for ketita de gamla. That's not something that we would generally say, right? Remember, things are muktzah if they're usable for their usual use, maybe you would say. So anyway, it's not, right? It's semi-muktzah. So then they say, okay, well, we have a better solution then. V'ha'anantnan. Oh, so somebody wrote, honey doesn't spoil. Okay, so that's a good question. What it means, there had to be something, it got ruined somehow, you'd have to say. Okay? So now they say, well, why didn't he just untie the ropes that were holding it onto the donkey and let it fall on the ground? Well, what's going to happen, obviously? Mitzvah it's going to break, right? Obviously, if it's in some earthenware vessel or something, you drop that on the floor, it's going to break, and then he's going to lose it. That's why. Well, then, why don't we try our solution that we mentioned previously of Rav Huna? And then he'll put it under there, and the honey will fall onto soft landing. Well, what's the problem? We all know with honey, anytime you start dealing with honey, it gets all over everything, right? Imagine your tablecloths on Rosh Hashanah, they're always disgusting, right? So they say mitanfe. What's going to happen? They're going to get dirty. And what's the problem if they get dirty? If you now have these sticky pillows and blankets, no one's going to want to use them. It's like that tablecloth, right? Sometimes your tablecloth Friday night, you might reuse it on Shabbat. It's just got some crumbs, no big deal. But Rosh Hashanah, there's no way you ever reuse them because they're full of honey and nobody would ever want to reuse that. So basically he's saying if you do that, if you drop it on the floor, something's going to spill, it's going to make it disgusting, and then you're obligated to come about to klimei chano. Well, now the final question you're all waiting for is, but what happened to that? So the answer, kasavar tsar balei chayim de Rabbanan. There's a machloket, is tsar balei chayim de oraita or de Rabbanan. We actually paskin that it's de oraita, it's by Torah law, and then if Rabban Gamliel held that, there was no way he would do this. But because it's de Rabbanan, and because this issue, mevatel kli mehechano, was an issue, also a de Rabbanan issue, he thought that issue overrode the tsar balei chayim, and because of that, he left it on the donkey. But what do you see here? That clearly, I think, that the Braita brought this story to teach you that he made a mistake, right? That the animal died. The fact that the punchline of the story is the animal died, I think they're trying to tell you that this was a mistake. Okay. And in any case, we passed in Tsar Balei Chayim is Doraita, so lahalacha lamase, we certainly would have to take it off the animal. Okay. Now we're going to talk about using animals on Shabbat. So the background issue is like this. You're not allowed to ride on an animal on Shabbat. Why not? There's a concern that generally people would leave the animal with a stick. This goes on nowadays also. And because of that, you would maybe, if you don't have a stick to leave the animal, you break off a branch from a tree and use it as a stick. Because of that, you can't ride on an animal. Because you can't ride on an animal, they also forbade you to use an animal. So you can't use an animal for any purpose. Not just if you're working the animal, mechamer, that's a separate thing, but even just to use the animal for anything. So now we're going to see a machloket Abaye and Rava about this. Abaye eshkechele le Rabba, remember Rabba was his adopted father. Abaye finds Rabba and he sees the kamashafshef le lebere agava de chamra. He's playing with his child playfully on the backs of the donkey. Okay, I see someone wrote donkey slides, right? He's using it as a game. Amalei, and it was Shabbat, obviously. He says, Kamishhtamish mar b'balei chayim. Abaye, he's always questioning Rabba about things he does. He says, right, he wasn't so inhibited. Sometimes you'd be inhibited to ask your rabbi all sorts of questions like this, but since he was his adopted father, he didn't feel difficult, he wasn't hesitant to ask him questions, or maybe it was Abaye's personality. He says, but are you using animals? How can you do this? Amarle, stadin hen, utstadin lo gazru b'hu Rabbanan. I'm using just the side of the animal. I'm not actually using the animal itself for something the animal's doing. I'm just using the back of the animal. That's just stadin. That's okay. Now we're going to see that Abaye doesn't agree with Rabba. Abaye and Rabba have a debate about this. Abaye thinks stadin are forbidden, and Rabba thinks they're allowed. So Minatimra, where does Rabba get this from? Ditnan. It says in the Mishnah, our Mishnah, Matir chavalim vasakim gaflim. Now, why is that using the animal? My lab b'chavar gavalki. I told you we have a lot of words that you've never seen before. Dahavu leit stadin utstadin lagazru b'hu rabbanan. Okay, this is some sort of way that the bags are tied on. Okay, imagine there's a nice picture in the Koran if you have it. There's a donkey with a rope, and the rope is bound around the back of the donkey, and on both sides the rope it kind of swings around, kind of like if you have a roof rack, right, and you tie it around. So likewise, it's tied around, and there's two bags, one on either side. And in order to remove the rope, it's very taut, so you have to kind of move. You have to lean on the animal, push it to loosen it, right? You don't know when you have a rope, you have to push it on one side, loosen it on the other. That means you're ending up leaning on the animal. So that would be the issue here. So he says, and look, it says you could do this anyway. So that's my proof, Rabba says, right? They didn't say that was forbidden. So the Gemara rejects this proof and says, no, you could say, lo b'chavar agavalki, not gavalki, but agavalki, or delo havut stadin. Either it's where they were hooked together with like a nail, and all you have to do is pull the nail out. That releases the hooks, which releases the ropes, and they drop, and then you don't have to actually use the animal at all. Inami belachta, or with a rope. Rashi explains that there's a board in between. You use a rope, and there's a board, and you just pull out the board, and like a wooden board, and it all falls out. So anyway, you could explain that you don't actually have to use the animal, so that doesn't necessarily prove Rabba. Now comes Rabbi's question on Rabba. Eitive. We have a sukkah that's built, two walls are built by man, and one is a tree, okay? Is relying on a tree. We're going to see exactly what this means. It's a good sukkah. The tree can function as a wall, but ein olin la b'yom tov. Okay, there's a few different interpretations of what it means. Some will say it's referring to the something about the ground. Most people say it's referring to the schach. The schach is leaning on the tree, and people would put things on top of their schach, like to put things, to store things, I guess like they did on their roofs, I'm not sure, but basically you can't put things on the schach because you're using the wall, and the wall is the tree, and you can't use the tree on Shabbat or Yom Tov. So on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to put stuff on top of the schach, or maybe even go into the sukkah, possibly, which is a funny thing. You build a sukkah and you can't go into it because they say the floor is leaning on the wall, and then you can't go on the floor of the sukkah, so that's another possibility. So now they assume, what does this mean? They want to say that this is a case of stadin. And what do you see? It's stadin or forbidden. Why is it stadin? My love dechak be beilan davulet stadin. Stadin asulim. It must be, what does it mean it's a tree is a wall? Well, it must be, what'd you do? You put up beams and hung the wall up, attached to the beams. You attached them. And where were the beams standing? They were standing in the tree. You made a hole in the tree. The beams are put into those holes. On that, right, is your wall. Your wall is attached to that, and your schach is on top of that. So now the beams that hold up the wall are attached to the tree. So basically, this whole wall is leaning on the tree, but stadin. You're not actually using the tree. You're using the holes that you made from the tree, right, in the base of the tree just for supporting. So that would be stadin. So Abai assumes that's the case of the Mishnah, and therefore says it's a problem. So then they say, lo, Rabba says, no, that's not the way to understand it. You bent the tree over, and you're actually leaning it on the tree itself. You're putting the schach on the tree. And then you're actually really using the tree. So then Abai says you can't say that's the case, because look at the next case in the Mishnah. If three are man-made, remember you only really need three walls of a sukkah. And one is made by the tree. You can even put stuff on top of the schach or use the floor. If it's actually leaning on the tree, then you shouldn't be allowed to use this on Yom Tov. Okay, so therefore, he rejects this interpretation of Abai. And then he said, right, so it can't be that it's actually of Rabbi. It can't be it's actually the tree, right? So now, what does Abai think? Abai thinks again that it's leaning on it. So now they say, wait a minute. Umay, and yet it's asur in the case of two walls. So now Abai is going to have a problem. Elamai, stadin asurin, sof amay olin la b'yom tov. But the last case in the Mishnah is going to be a problem. If there's three walls and a tree, and the tree is, we're using the tree as a base, we're leaning on it, right? We cut out a hole, the beams are in there, the wall's on that, the schach is on that, that's stadin. So why, if Abaye thinks Stadin is Asurim, what's the difference with the 3 walls? What's the difference if there's 2 walls? It should all be a problem. Elahatam, here's our next term that you've never heard of, Bigo Aza Parsikana. Okay, what is Goaza Parsikana? We're going to say, Di'ilan Gufei Dofen Ba'al Mahu Deshavia. In other words, this is where the tree itself grew and kind of formed a wall. But so the 4th wall is just this formation of the tree that grew. You didn't bend it over and you're leaning the schach on it. It just forms a wall, but the wall doesn't actually go up to the schach. You have 3 walls, and the schach is suspended on those 3 walls that are man-made. And the tree forms the 4th wall, but it doesn't actually reach the top. So it's not like the schach is leaning on it. So you could say that that's possibly the case. And then it's not a case of Stadin at all because it's not even leaning on it. Daikanami, Dikatani, you can further prove it because the end of the Mishnah says, Zehaklal. What does it say? As if you would remove the tree, the sukkah would still be standing, then we're going to say you can use it on Yom Tov. And that would be exactly this case, where it's not even leaning on the tree because the tree is not a supporting wall in any way. But now they're going to suggest that this whole machloket is actually a machloket Tanaim. In other words, the issue of can you use the sukkah or not is a machloket Tanaim, and they're going to bring another opinion that we didn't see before. And according to this interpretation, we just kind of suggested a bunch of different ways of understanding what the tree case was. But now they're going to go back to assuming that the tree case was the classic case of Tzedin, where you made a hole, the beams were supported by the tree, and from there we get the wall, from there we get the schach, and it's all leaning on the tree. So my love, lema kitanai. Let's suggest this is a machloket Tanaim, the same machloket that Rabbi and Abaye are having. Ein olin la b'yom tov. That's what we saw. Rashba, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Mishum Rabbi Meir, olin la b'yom tov. You can use it on Yom Tov. So my lava kamiflage. Is this not the machloket? Demar savar tzadin asurin, umar savar mutarim. One says it's forbidden, one says it's permitted. Amar Abaye lo. Abaye says no. Tikule alma tzadin asurin. V'hacha b'tzidei tzadin kamiflage. Abaye says no. Everyone agrees with me all the time. Everyone thinks tzadin is asurin. This is already majorly indirect. This is, right, see that there's the hole in the tree, from there there's the beam, from there there's the wall, from there there's the schach. That's already much more indirect. And the machloket is, do we say tzidei tzadim or asurim or not? So, mar savar tzidei tzadim asurim, umar savar tzidei tzadim mutarim. The 2 different opinions are, do we also not allow indirect or not? Indirect of indirect. Rava disagrees with that and says he wants to show that one opinion holds like me. He says, no, I disagree with your theory, Abaye. Manda asur b'tzadim, asurami b'tzidei tzadim. There's once you're indirect, you're indirect. It doesn't matter how indirect you get. So he says, whoever says tzadin is asurim, tzidei tzadim is going to be asurim. Manda shari b'tzidei tzadim, sharinami b'tzadim. And whoever allows it, allows it. And therefore he says, according to Rava, this would be the machloket Tanaim between the 2. It would be tzadim asurim or not, even though this is much more, right? This is a more indirect case than using the sides of the animal. Okay, with that, we'll end for today. In the next year, we'll get to more questions on Rava and finish up to the Mishnah, and then we have more to go. So Shabbat Shalom to everybody.